Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Shail. This is our second evening of sharing interesting things we found out about the Tyne Theatre and Opera House in our project trying to build a calendar of everything that it did between 1867 and 1919. What I'm going to do this evening is I've got one interesting thing to show you, and then I've got another interesting thing to show you. I'll do the first one and then I'll let the others take their turns, and if there's time at the end I'll show you my second thing. In fact, let's hope there's time, because that's when I will explain that Harry Lauder song that I just played there. Right, so let's just point out where we're at with this project. So we have now photographed and scanned absolutely everything we can find by way of newspaper advertisements, programmes, posters, and reviews that are held in Tyne Archives and the City Library. That has totalled over 23,000 files altogether. And the team of volunteers have now managed to complete 24 of the 52 years that we're covering thus far. So if we go to that one, click on, this is the SharePoint where we're doing it at the Tyne Theatre Zone file space. And if we click on Worksheet, you can see here that if it's got the word complete in the right, then it has been done. And we're basically halfway there with those. And then we have very few years where there isn't somebody working on it yet. Just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 out of 52 years where there isn't someone working on it. So we should be very soon done the vast majority of these years. And of course what we're very keen on is trying to find out some human stories in here. And just to point out, some of you have already written up your human stories. There are now 5, if I'm not much mistaken, on the Tyne Theatre Zone website, which Rachel's been getting put up for us, including my own recently updated one on the where the Westgate Hall came from. So this room that is now the bistro bar, that was the grand salon. It's got a really checkered history. So that's a particular thing that David Wilmore, who's in charge of the project, asked me to look into, and it is now done and completely updated. But glad to see that I'm not the only one who's been going and doing excavating to find out interesting things. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to show you. Right, in this period that we're looking at, as well as now, theatre was and is a seasonal industry, at least in those cities that weren't also summer resorts, mainly because the clientele that frequented theatres would spend their time going to places that weren't these cities with theatres in during the summer. It's not that it's too hot to be in a theatre, because theatres are generally quite cool buildings. It's just these were people who were generally travelling. I've looked at the seasonality of my own hometown of Malvern, which had a roaring tourist trade at all times, and that did play a lot of stuff during the summer. So, as all of our volunteers will have abundantly noticed, it was normal for the theatre to be dark for June and July each year. But of course, it is a pain for any venue that costs so much just to heat to ever be dark, or indeed, if not even aiming to heat it, just to staff it, put a skeleton staff on, it costs a lot of money. So it's bad for such a building to ever be dark. So canny managers of this venue and all theatres are generally on the lookout for something else that they can put on during the summer. And that included the temporary conversion of the Tyne Theatre to a roller skating rink that in 1876 in the summer that I told you about last time. Now, interestingly, other forms of entertainment at this particular time I'll look at now, such as music hall and cinema, were much less seasonal. Now, let's take a look at what was happening in the early 1910s. This is very, very typical. Now, you'll see it's supposed to be in yellow. For some reason, it's showing in white. I've put the text live on each of these bars here. So this just shows what the Tyne Theatre is doing in 1911, and of course we start off in January with the tail end of the last December's pantomime, dramas, operas, lots of different comedies, lots of different forms of live performance, but I've just blocked them all together as live. And it plays, all of this live performances continue to be produced until early June, and then the theatre goes dark for the rest of June, all of July and a bit of August. The season begins again on about the 10th of August, and then there is another small period of darkness, which is the get-in for the pantomime. And it's quite normal for the theatre to be closed for about a week, maybe 2, maybe even 3, to set up the pantomime. So we'll see that pattern happening every year. In 1912, there's even more dark time there, so the theatre's not even open into June. So, completely normal. And then in 1913, we have this. So this is the advertisement from the Newcastle Evening Chronicle for the very last day of, and it says last week of the dramatic season, so the very last day of this comedy, The Dust of Egypt, which is, of course, a live performance. And it's announcing that the following week they will be showing pictures, they'll be showing films. So it's Paul J. Rainey's African Hunt. It's not a fiction film, but it is a roughly feature length. It's quite a long non-fiction film. So there's this announcement here that what's going to be playing after the end of the dramatic season at the theatre is at least a week or so of films. So if we look at our calendar here, I'm going to show you what the theatre then did for the rest of the 1910s. The reason why 1919 isn't on there is the theatre closed permanently in the first day of March 1919. So this pattern I'm going to show you, there's no opportunity in 1919 for it to happen. By something like July, I think it was, 1919, it had reopened as the Stoll Picture Theatre. So in 1913, there we have Rainey's African Hunt there, small dark period, and then more films, and then a live performance for a week, then a bit more dark time, and then live performances. And interestingly, that year, no pantomime. There wasn't necessarily a pantomime every year. Evening, Martin. And this may seem like a bit of an oddity. This is a time when a venue decides to put on a little something unusual during the summer. And if you look at what happens the next year, we might think, yeah, it's a bit of an oddity because the same thing doesn't happen at the end of the 1913-1914 dramatic season. There is no showing of films at the end, but there is some showing of films before the beginning of the next one. I've just quickly marked there a thing that people often like to point to as being a really momentous event in the history of cinema, which is the outbreak of the First World War. But that's not what seems to have caused this inception of showing films during the summer at the Tyne Theatre to have happened. It had already started to happen. Next year, nothing. Next year, they do it again. But again, with a live performance sprinkled in the middle. And notice what's happening here is the summer is getting substantially shorter. The dark season is getting shorter. 1917, they do it again, but still with a relatively substantial summer dark period. And then in 1918, I'm completely enthralled by what's happening here. The venue essentially does not shut for the whole of the summer at all. What that suggests is that this is a really thriving venue that's really turning a profit. So it would be completely surprising to find that it just couldn't function anymore beyond the beginning of March 1919. Or it's a venue that is very much desperate to try to realise profit, to try and squeeze profit out of every single possible opportunity, and so it's throwing as much stuff onto its stage as it can. And I suppose I ought to show you the relevant context for this happening, which is, this might look like it took ages to put together, but this is just me going into the city library and getting Ward's directory, which is essentially the forerunner of the phone book. It listed the occupant of every single commercial and residential building in the city, and it had a section specifically devoted to entertainment venues. And what we see here at the bottom is theatres, so the Tyne Theatre is in this population at the bottom here. And this directory was only published once every other year, and up until 1917, and only then did it get published every year. So theatres, 3 or 4 in the city. Music halls, again, 3 or 4. There's another roller skating craze. Yeah, happens a lot. But of course, the thing that is probably jumping out at you right here is cinemas. It's the emergence of the cinema building across the Western world, essentially. So when the 1909 version of Ward's Directory is published, we have the first 4. There weren't any in the 1907 directory. 1911 it's 12, 1913 it's 20. This is a massive outpouring of a new industry. And this is just in Newcastle. It's not Tyneside, it's just Newcastle. And so, of course, what we see happening at the Tyne Theatre, I spent ages trying to get the dates on the left so that it marries up with the previous chart, but you can translate. So what's happening with the Tyne Theatre is that at this point here, that's when it starts showing films. So there's definitely a popular demand for this form of entertainment, and it definitely tries to take a specific niche in the field of film exhibition, because it showed films that were generally a lot longer than the films that were showing in these cinemas. These cinemas would still show quite a program of quite short films, a program that might last 2 hours, but it would have 10 films in it, quite short films. The Tyne Theatre was showing longer films, so it's already trying to occupy a niche. And that raises the question of, can a theatre sometimes be a cinema? And rather than debating this for the rest of the evening, I just say, yes, it can. For these brief periods here, we have an event in which a theatre is practically speaking a cinema. Now, the fact that the following year it became one might prompt us to go, well, you can see it just developing into a cinema. It wasn't actually that simple, because the venue entirely changed hands when it closed down and then became a Stoll picture theatre. So essentially, rather than gradually transitioning, it did die and get reborn. But what this suggests is that if that hadn't have happened, it might have entirely transitioned into a cinema. So it might have become a something picture theatre, the Tyne Theatre Picture Theatre, for example, or the Tyne Picture Theatre, rather than the Stoll, but would have essentially become the same thing as several other live venues did at this time. Okay, that is enough from me. Rachel?
I have a question.
I thought you might. Go ahead.
Because I was looking at 1915 with Lucy
Yes.
on whatever day it was this week. Where are we? Monday, I think.
Yeah.
And she was literally looking at May, and then it's disappeared off the newspapers.
Yes.
But the thing that we noticed was there was this Westgate Picture House, and we
Yes.
wondered whether that was a separate entity or whether that was the Tyne Theatre showing films. But I'm presuming that these films here were still under the heading Tyne Theatre, were they?
Yes.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware, the Westgate Picture House was just another venue on the same street. As in, it's one of these 23 cinemas, very much sprinkled around the city at the time. Yeah, so it had a competitor on its doorstep when it started to show films. There was already a cinema on that street, several within easy walking distance, all showing films, and yet it still had a go. It thought, this may be a way of squeezing some profit out of the dark season. Any other questions? Okay.
So what
Go
sort
ahead.
of films were they showing? Was it all like that?
Uh,
Documentary on African hunting, or?
Interestingly, no. The 1916 film is The Birth of a Nation. It's this, oh blimey, how many reels was Birth of a Nation? It's probably something like 9 or 10 reels, a good 3 hours long. One of the longest feature films that had ever been made at the time. So this was a venue that was trying to show films that some cinemas just wouldn't show because they were just too long to fit into a single programme. So again, after an initial bit of flirting with a few factual films from about 1940, from about that point onwards, the majority of these films are fiction, and they're showing for at least a week at a time, which is quite a long time in the context of the period. It was normal for cinemas at the time to change their films once every 3 working days. So that means you get a new programme on a Monday and then a new one on a Thursday. It will be closed on the Sunday, of course, so that's it. Every 3 days the programme's changed. These films will be showing at the Tyne Theatre for at least 1 week at a time. Birth of a Nation showed for about a month, I think. So, yeah, I wanted to avoid showing you the very specific films that were being shown here, so I could show you the larger pattern. But hey, maybe we'll do a third one, and I'll look into the specific films that were being shown. Okay, I don't want to hog anyone else's time. I know we have several other people here who'd like to share. You've had enough of hearing me, so unless there's any other questions. Some of you might have thought, why is this person who's a film historian into the history of the Tyne Theatre? Now, it's in part because back in 2017, as part of the 150th anniversary celebrations, I did a little one-man show at the theatre about the history of film exhibition in the venue. And at the time I mentioned a very curious instance of film exhibition from 1906. So Frederick Wyndham chose Aladdin for the Tyne Theatre's pantomime in the 1906 to 1907 season. At the time, the Tyne Theatre was a Howard and Wyndham theatre. It was effectively part of a chain of theatres. This production at the Tyne Theatre ran from the 22nd of December 1906 to the 2nd of March 1907, which was normal. And this production, it's Howard and Wyndham's 24th Newcastle pantomime. Howard had died several years before, but Frederick Wyndham was running the chain of theatres. And this production had already run before. It had run in the 1905 to 1906 pantomime season at the Theatre Royal in Glasgow, from 7th of December 1905 into at least February 1906. And then the next year, the same production of Aladdin would be performed at yet another Howard and Wyndham theatre, the Theatre Royal in Edinburgh, from about the 12th of December 1907 to February 1908. So same performers, mostly the same performers, same script and songs, and we're lucky enough to have a copy of the script in the City Library. Now, perhaps because this production had already played at another venue the previous year, making it predictable that it would play at the Tyne Theatre this year, 1906 to 1907, at the same time that the Tyne Theatre was staging Aladdin, so was the Theatre Royal. It's like they tried to steal a march on the Tyne Theatre. So yeah, there's the Theatre Royal doing their pantomime Aladdin, and there's the Tyne Theatre doing their pantomime Aladdin. Very different versions. Yes, and of course they could be radically different versions of Aladdin. Now, we know for sure that the version of Aladdin that played at the Tyne Theatre was the same version that had played at the Glasgow Theatre Royal the previous year, because it had mostly the same cast. And the part that I want to focus on, so there's Bessie Featherstone, who died partway through this production, which is why, for the person who's doing the 1907 spreadsheet, they'll see that it's Beryl Somerset who's playing Aladdin instead. Yeah, her understudy has taken over. Right, so the part that I really want to focus on is a part that happens about here, in the transition between scene 8 and scene 9. Yeah, what's Aladdin doing with a bit at the North Pole? It's clearly very Edwardian stuff. And I just want to point out, why was I playing you a little song by Harry Lauder earlier? And that's because the character of Roderick McSwankey, as in the Widow Twankey character, is being played by Harry Lauder. So a music hall star is treading the boards of a classier venue at the time. He's clearly so famous that that's a very big draw, having Harry Lauder in Aladdin, in his full kilt and tam o'shanter, and speaking in his lowland Scots dialect as well. So the part that I want to focus on, so like I said, between scenes 8 and 9, luckily we have a description in the review in the Newcastle Daily Journal. So, quote, Abanazar here, with the assistance of his apprentice, that is the McSwankey, played by Harry Lauder, outwits the princess and gains the coveted lamp, whereupon the scene is changed by magic to a wilderness where McSwankey sings in doleful humour that proved altogether funny, the reason why I wear a kilt. Abanazar abducts the princess in a motor car, and its course in a mad run through Europe is shown by cinematograph. The pictures causing great amusement until the arrival in the polar regions, where the car is soon ascending and descending icy mountain slopes, with a speed far beyond any known limitation. Then the scene changes to the North Pole, where the actual car has arrived, and the other characters having followed by balloon, there is fun amongst the ice. So essentially a short bit of film here was being used to replace a scene change, actually to cover up a scene change. And I found out about this, not because I was reading through reviews, but because I was reading through the minutes of Newcastle City Council's Town Improvement and Streets Committee's subcommittee on theatre licensing, which mentioned that briefly during late 1906 and early 1907, the theatre's license had to have extra clauses added to it about fire safety, because they would have a cinematograph on the stage, which means that they would have the projector behind the screen and project it from the rear, which was a normal thing to do at the time. But a theatre projector back then, it would have been a real pain to project it from in the auditorium, so just behind the screen is just simpler, would have been easy to cover up a scene change. So we're talking about a situation where live action is happening on the stage, and then this screen is wheeled in perhaps, or revealed. This transitional bit of a film is projected, and then it's covered up again, and then another live scene happens in this new location. Now, when I did my one-man show in 2017, I had not yet identified which film was used for this footage. I have now, thanks to a colleague, actually. So, it was Georges Méliès's 1905 film Le Raid Paris-Monte Carlo en 2 heures. And this is the specific bit that I think was used on the stage at the Tyne Theatre, and of course the previous year at the Glasgow Theatre Royal, and the subsequent year at the Edinburgh Theatre Royal. And bear in mind that almost certainly the version that the Tyne Theatre would have used would have been hand-coloured. Méliès was very big on the people at his studio creating a cheap print, which would be black and white, and then a more expensive print, which would be hand-coloured. And almost certainly that's what would have been used for a stage production. So it's silent, of course, because it's silent, but imagine amateur, improvised musical accompaniment. So it being a Méliès film, there's trick cinematography of many kinds, including what's known as the stop trick, which he didn't invent, but he very much used it a lot. There's one stop used, another stop used there. And that performer there is probably Méliès himself. He appeared in a lot of his own films.
What do you mean by a stop?
Oh, the stop trick is where you film somebody, and then you stop moving, stop rotating, stop winding the camera. The person freezes, you then substitute something, and then you start winding the camera again. And if you do that, or you do something the other way around, where you get the person to stop, and then you remove someone, and then you start winding it again, and the result is that things seem to appear and disappear or transform from one thing into another. It was often accompanied by having to do a little bit of editing to take out a few frames where you could see the actors have stopped, because you didn't quite get it lined up. But that it was the way that he did stage magic in film form. Okay, so that's what we just saw. We just saw... its course in a mad run through Europe is shown by cinematograph, the pictures causing great amusement until the arrival in the polar regions. The car is soon ascending and descending icy mountain slopes, and so on. Okay, so, having identified the film, I thought I'd look into the history of the film. Now, the idea of incorporating a film into a live performance, in fact, the idea of incorporating this specific film, and this is from earlier in the film, from bit before, bit I just showed you, that idea was not Frederick Wyndham's idea, or the scriptwriter J. Hickory Wood's idea. This particular film was a re-edit of an earlier version that Georges Méliès had made in 1904, in late 1904, to be included in a review at the Folies Bergère in Paris, which was the home of cabaret reviews. And the idea was credited to the director of the Folies Bergère, Victor de Coton. Now, this 1904 version of the film, it would form most of one scene of a 14-scene review, a review that ran at the Folies Bergère from the last day of 1904 until the end of June 1905. So ran solidly for 6 months. That's more than 300 performances. This particular scene in the review, it started as a live scene on the stage, showing the drivers in Paris getting ready for a car race from Paris to Monte Carlo, and then the film, which featured the same actors as had been appearing on the stage, would then be projected, and it showed the antics of King Leopold II of Belgium, who was notorious in real life for driving and crashing cars, in this race from Paris to Monte Carlo. And then at the end of the film, which ends with lots of crashing, after the end, the same actors would return to the stage and continue to play out the aftermath of this race. And the film is staged so as to stress that it's using recognisable performers who worked long term at the Folies Bergère, including this performer, for example. I know you might be thinking, I know who that is. It's not. That's not Harry Ralph, whose music hall persona was called Little Titch. That's a French impersonator of Harry Ralph's Little Titch character who called himself Little Pitch. This actor here, also tremendously tall, would have been recognisable to audiences. A lot of these actors would have been recognisable to audiences and then would reappear after the end of this film to continue the action as part of this review. So whoever it was that came up with the idea of using a short segment of this second commercially released version of Méliès's film as part of the Howard and Wyndham production of Aladdin, so whoever it was, maybe it was Frederick Wyndham, maybe it was J. Hickory Wood, whoever it was, what they were doing was just slightly adapting a specific combination of live performance and film that had probably, this was a very novel thing at the time, probably become very well known in the theatre world at the time, which was a very international world. So in all likelihood, people like Frederick Wyndham and Fred Sutcliffe, the acting manager, would have been reading quite possibly the Stage or the Era, these London-produced journals of the theatre and music hall world. And both of these magazines, newspapers, they had European correspondence, they had Paris correspondence, or they may even have been reading the French language, Paris-based theatre journals as well. So it's very, very, in fact, it's almost a certainty that they would have heard about what had been done at the Folies Bergère in Paris in the first half of 1905 and essentially gone, right, we'll do our own version of that and we'll even use exactly the same film, but we'll use just a small segment of it and we'll crowbar it into Aladdin. Crowbar, a bit of a film about a race from Paris to Monte Carlo featuring King Leopold II of Belgium into Aladdin. I was so happy when I found out about this, because that's just, it tells us something about the entertainment world at the time that I think is very revealing. Anyway.
Some things never change, because certainly our pantomime last couple of years has included a 3D sequence of monsters coming out of the screen at you.
Yes.
It's very scary. I screamed.
Yeah, this is a multimedia performance, a multimodal, some of my colleagues would say, performance. Embracing a new technology.
Do we know whether that then happened in any of the pantomimes after 1906? Or?
I don't. Any of these ring a bell, Martin, from your reviews?
No, I remember this one. Because I thought that was interesting. There was something about something going around the moon, but it rather than going up that, so it could have been done, but I can't remember it being actually a pantomime. It might have been in one of the other comedies.
There is...
There was a Méliès trip to the moon, wasn't there?
Yeah, but I'm also thinking of Robert Paul's 1905-ish film, The Question Mark Motorist, which has a scene in it where a car drives around the moon. Like a magical car gets transported to
Yeah.
the moon and drives around, and it's like cars. Remember Button Moon?
Yeah.
Okay, it's that kind of scale. You know, the car is just 1/20th the size of the moon and is going around it. So, but yes, quite possibly these things would have been folded into performances that weren't pantomimes. Yeah, maybe.
But that's this whole idea of things in the variety theatres, which was all about different terms.
Yes.
The cinema was in there quite early.
Yes.
They were showing little short films as terms.
Yeah.
And,
Newcastle has pride of place in the history of film exhibition in this country in being the very first city outside London to show films in a music hall. I think it was it's the building that was demolished where Oxfam is now. Is that the Palace Theatre? One of the music halls. Yeah, they was the first
Yes.
city outside of London to show films as part of its evening of terms.